In this week's Training Focus, we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the implications you can get in cause and manner of death rulings. We would like to think that after we make a ruling as to the cause of death and assign the manner of death, that many times that's where it would stop. Like we've determined that this person died of natural causes or a suicide, homicide, maybe an accident, and then there's times, of course, we have to rule it undetermined. But those rulings, although they seem simple, and sometimes obviously they're not simple, but in some cases they are, there still can be some implications that you will get feedback from families and from others. For instance, we know the 5 manners of death: natural, accident, suicide, homicide, and of course that dreaded undetermined. So most of us know, but I'll tell you anyway, there's a difference between cause and manner. The manner of death is assigned by the medical examiner or coroner. It can also be assigned by a doctor if they're signing out the death certificate. A natural death is defined as a death caused solely and completely by a disease or natural process. So if, for instance, cancer or a heart attack or something along those lines, a brain tumor, it's something that's natural. Now, if some of those same things are caused by maybe an accidental thing. For instance, someone has pneumonia and they ended up dying of pneumonia, but they got the pneumonia because they had a near drowning experience in the river. And although they were recovered from that, they quickly became sicker and pneumonia, and they died of pneumonia. But if that pneumonia can be traced back to their time a few days ago in the river, then that may most likely be considered an accidental death. But again, people may not completely agree with that ruling. Here are some implications that you might receive. So you want to really think about the rulings that you make, and you want to be able to justify those rulings in your report, in your narrative, so that anyone can come along and read your report. And even if they don't agree with you, they still read it and like, well, based on everything you have here, I see how you could have come up with that decision. Although your decision is wrong, I see how you could have come up with it, right? Because some people just aren't going to agree. But if you don't have it spelled out in your report with supporting facts, evidence, things like that, you're going to be open to interpretation. Now, let me qualify this real quickly by saying sometimes our cause and manner rulings are based upon a preponderance of the evidence, and it's the most probable cause of death. And there's a lot of examples, but we may have somebody that has a history of heart attacks, and he is known to have a lot of blockage. He is known to have had other myocardial infarctions in the past, and the myocardial infarction is caused from blockage. And so there is a time that he is found unresponsive. It may or may not have been witnessed, but he's found unresponsive. He's 76 years old, and there is no evidence of trauma. There's no evidence of injury. There is nothing about the witnesses or the scene or the investigation, anything that would lead a person to believe that this was homicide or suicide or whatever. Now, we might feel like we want to draw blood for toxicology if we felt like something was wrong, right? But most of the time, that's not going to happen, quite honestly, especially with that medical history. So the preponderance of the evidence would likely be a myocardial infarction, cause of death natural. Now, it might not be, but there might be things that we just don't know, but we can't autopsy and or toxicology every 76-year-old male with a cardiac history that's found dead in bed or fell on the floor. He might have died of an aneurysm. He might have had a massive stroke, fell to the floor and died, and you got home and found him. So, again, it's the most probable cause. So in those situations, you may or may not get a lot of kickback, but you certainly can get kickback in other ways. And in most cases, you will not get a lot of kickback in cause. If you call it a heart attack, nobody's probably going to fight with you and say, well, was it a heart attack? Was it a stroke? If someone has cancer and they died of cancer, you're probably going to get a lot of kickback on that. Where you're going to get a lot of kickback from is your manner rulings. So let's talk about that. You rule a death a suicide. you're going to have family stigma attached to that. There's a lot of families that does not want their loved one to have died of suicide, and they don't think their loved one would have ever done that, and they don't want people to think that their loved one had done that. And so you're going to get some feedback on that where, someone killed Uncle Bob. There's no way he would have died by suicide. And that's pretty common. Then there's insurance issues. If you rule something as suicide, some insurance companies won't pay. Some will. Some will within a certain amount of time. But your report is going to be scrutinized by the insurance company. If you're going to call it a suicide, then they're going to base their payment or non-payment on your report. So your report has to be very thorough. Sometimes there's religious beliefs where, and I've had this happen. Families come in and said, you cannot rule my daughter's death a suicide because in our belief, if she died by suicide, she'll go to hell. The problem with that, as you might imagine, is coroners have a lot of power when it comes to ruling cause and manners, but not that much power. It really doesn't matter what I put on that death certificate. That's between them and God. But people will want you to change it because of those things. So the biggest reason is religious issues, insurance, and family stigma. Those are going to be your biggest kickbacks. And of course, people thinking that someone murdered their husband rather than he shot himself. And then homicide. If you rule a death a homicide, the police has to work the case. Now, sometimes we rule things homicide that are not necessarily workable. So it's justifiable homicide or whatever. But if you have a case that you've investigated and you rule it homicide, that creates an open homicide case for law enforcement, and they may or may not like that because they may or may not agree with you. This is where we need to work together with law enforcement and come up with the same conclusions. Of course, the families want answers. If you rule something a suicide, if you rule something a homicide, the family's going to want you to arrest somebody or the police arrest somebody. And so that means that there are family pressure on law enforcement to arrest the guilty party. So when you rule it suicide, then it obviously sets up that feedback loop with family. And then until a suspect is caught, if it's not a family family homicide, where it could be a stranger homicide or you don't have a suspect, well, you've got a scared community. So they're wanting this case solved. You ruled it a homicide, and now they're wanting this case solved. I don't know why I've got suicide stuck in my brain today. So we talked about suicide. We talked about some implications in homicide. Police have to do the work. Family wants answers. The community can be scared. Again, those are implications that you're going to have. Accident. So if you rule something an accident, who might be responsible for that? If it was a workplace issue, then there could be lawsuits. And if there's lawsuits, then that creates a lot of court battles and things like that because you ruled it an accident. Did the 59-year-old man working in the factory or working at a company have a heart attack and die, and it was a natural, or did he fall and trip on the conveyor belt and died because there was no safety mechanisms put in place to prevent that? So if you ruled it an accidental death, then they've got lawsuits possibly coming. If you ruled it a natural death, well, then he was dead before he fell and hit or certainly unconscious or whatever. Again, that can be a big implications for you. Insurance companies, again, sometimes they will pay out double. They don't pay out sometimes on suicides, but sometimes with certain accidents, they'll pay double. And so if you're going to rule something an accident, the insurance company is going to scrutinize that report because they're going to want to find holes in it so they don't have to pay. Someone has to determine if there's fault rest on anyone but the deceased. If it's an accident, who was at fault? Was it just the deceased at fault? Was it a roadway issue, a sidewalk issue, a machine issue? Was it a product that failed? But who could have been at fault? Could it have been prevented? Was there something about the area of the scene, the activity that could have prevented the accident? You're going to get a lot of questions on that. Not necessarily you're going to determine if it could have been prevented, but obviously if you rule it an accident, there are many wheels that start in motion and many agencies that start looking at these things in certain cases. And certainly you'll be called into question on that because you've ruled it an accident. Someone else, though, may want to claim it was not an accident. This person had a heart attack. Or it may have been an accident, but it wasn't the fault of the machinery. It was the fault of the person doing something wrong. As a coroner's medical examiner, that isn't necessarily our role. Our role is to determine if it was an accident or not. Autoerotic. If someone dies of an autoerotic accident, they are accidents. They are not suicides, no matter what the scene looks like. If you've got enough markers in a scene to call it autoerotic, then it's an accident. But some insurance companies don't want to pay those because the person should have known the risk. Well, that's arguable in court. I've seen court cases. I've read about court cases where some insurance companies have won and they've not paid. Some have lost and they've had to pay. So it depends on the court. But again, autoerotic fatalities are accidents, but the insurance companies certainly may fight that, especially if it was a ligature strangulation or something like that. And then naturals. If you rule something natural, you think, well, that's simple. It's a natural. Well, the family might not agree with that. The family may blame the doctor or caregiver. So you're ruling it a natural, but the family says it's not, yes, they may have had cancer or they may have had a heart attack or they may have had this or one thing or another, but it's the doctor's fault. It's a homicide or it's a caregiver. The caregiver didn't do the right job. They didn't give the medication correctly or they over-medicated. So they don't want to just accept that grandpa died. They want to blame somebody. And because you ruled it a natural, they may come back and say it's not natural. The caregiver smothered him or whatever, overdosed him, whatever. Of course, families may not agree. They may not get the insurance benefits if it's a natural causes death. Some insurance, if you read your insurance policies, and let me take a side note here, you need to read your insurance policies because there are some policies out there that you buy that you think you're covered. If you die, you're covered. But some of them in the fine print says if you die of cancer, they won't cover. Cancer is a very big thing in America. So you need to read your life insurance policies because you personally could have a problem, your family could have a problem. And then, of course, our families that we deal with are upset because if we rule it a natural causes death when they think maybe it's an accident, that could be an insurance issue. If someone had cancer, then what from? I've had cases where a person was ruled it was a natural cause of death by cancer, but the family didn't want it to be called natural. They wanted it to be called an accidental death or even a homicide possibly because this person, along with many others, worked at some factory dock off the river in St. Louis, and there's a bunch of asbestos there, and they all got cancer, and they all died, and there was a big lawsuit, and they wanted our report to make sure we reflected that type of cancer, and it was caused from this, which would go back on this lawsuit. And I don't remember the exact details, but it was kind of a mess. Again, those are the implications you're going to get. Undetermined. You think, well, what are you going to do with undetermined? Well, somebody wants an answer. If grandpa's dead, my son's dead, my wife's dead, they want an answer. They want somebody to blame. They want to know why this person died. So when you make it undetermined, you're saying, I don't know if it's natural, accident, suicide. I don't know. So I'm going to rule it undetermined. And we're not going to go into the math to cause it undetermined. But basically, if you cannot be at least 50% sure of something, it's undetermined. Investigators get blamed for being inept. If you rule it undetermined, because that is the proper legal thing to do, because it is not, you cannot make a determination, then people will blame the coroner, the medical examiner, the police. Yeah, see, there's a stupid, they can't even determine why the person died. And as we know, sometimes there's certain circumstances where undetermined is the best answer at the time. And then a lot of times it doesn't allow for payouts or closure. One, it doesn't allow for families necessarily to emotionally close because they don't know why their loved one died. And sometimes if it's undetermined, again, you have insurance issues. The insurance isn't going to necessarily pay on an undetermined. There are some policies that will. Some won't pay the double indemnity on accidents. But if you rule it undetermined, there can be a lot of things happen. So understand that in every manner of death ruling, there can be some kickback to you. Not always, and not necessarily often, but it certainly can happen. And because it's not always and not often, it's ever more important to be sure that your narrative, your investigation, what you do is spelled out so plainly based upon the facts that you know that you can defend that, whether it be this week or 2 years from now. I would say if it happened all the time, we would get really good at covering our bases on these reports. But we get lax sometimes because it's a natural cause of death. You put 4 or 5 sentences in a narrative and you call it good, or accident or whatever, and then one of those comes back and haunts you because your report doesn't really back it up. Your report doesn't really say why you come up with that determination. And then that one family, that one insurance company, that one time, every few months is finally going to come up and raise its ugly head, and you're not going to be able to back up why you said what you said. So every single report needs to back up why you made that determination. So remember, implications are there in every ruling you make, even something that we think is simple as just manner of death. Hey, if you have not subscribed to the Death Investigator magazine, you need to do that today. This is a free online magazine, comes to your inbox every single month, and it is dedicated to the field of death investigation and all of those supporting roles. Each edition is packed with timely articles, interactive links to videos and audio training, and lots of extra. Articles are written by industry professionals. There's training announcements from various organizations across the country. And best of all, it's focused around our profession and our lives. There's articles in there that not only help you be a better investigator, but there's articles to help you be a better human, to be better in your family, to be better in your finances. This publication is a well-rounded publication that is focused on you. So subscribe today. Go to deathinvestigatormagazine.com and get your first free issue and then one each month thereafter.